Well, hello, everyone. We are so happy that you are here with us today. We are recording today's session. We will be sending out a link to it. It'll be posted on our website, it will be on YouTube, and we will be sending out a link to everyone who was registered. So if you want to re-listen to any of this at any point in time, you're going to be able to, if you so desire. So today's topic is the 24-25 FAFSA is coming soon. Thank goodness it's going to be here soon. We've been talking about it for a long time, so we're excited that it's almost here. I'm Mila Tappan. I'm the Manager of College Access and Outreach at FAME, and with me today is the fabulous Nikki Vachon. And so Nikki is going to be watching for your questions, answering your questions, or prompting me to stop, so I can address them if she thinks it's a question that would be good for everyone to hear. As mentioned, we did just turn off the chat. We want your questions, but we would like to have you put them in the Q&A, just because that makes it a lot easier for us to keep track of them and to be sure that they do indeed get answered. So here's what we're going to do today. We've got a pretty full agenda. But again, we're recording this. You've got the screenshots. So in some cases, we'll go into just a little bit of detail, but I wanted you to have more information on a variety of topics. So we're going to talk about some recent updates from federal student aid. Then we're going to talk about, and this is repetitive because we've been talking about kind of this section of the presentation, virtually every FAFSA presentation we're doing, which is what students and families need to do to get ready. We are intentionally being repetitive in some cases because it's a lot of information, and we're not able to talk about everything all the time, but there are some things that we think are absolutely critical. So we'll repeat those over and over. We are then going to talk about FSA ID updates. We're going to talk specifically about the fact that there is a new process for parents who don't have a Social Security number to be able to get an FSA ID. And then we're going to talk just a little bit about some of the process changes and formula changes to the FAFSA. So again, I know some of you have been with us through many of these presentations. At the end, I'm going to share where we have them all stored. So if you want to go back and listen to any of them. So we might have people though who are here for the very first time. So we're going to try to balance that today. So let's start with an announcement that came out from Federal Student Aid on November 15th. So on November 15th, they came out with this announcement that said that the FAFSA would be available by December 31st. Now, I guess it was good to have that confirmed, but by law, they had to have it out by January 1st. So we were pretty sure it was going to be out by December 31st. But we don't know exactly when. It could be the 31st. We've heard some rumors they might do a soft launch and not announce it, but maybe someone just goes and ta-da, it's there and available a few days before the 31st. Certainly, as we learn stuff, we're going to share it with you. Now, one of the reasons I think they did this announcement was because they let us know that schools will begin receiving information, the FAFSA records, which are officially referred to as Institutional Student Information Records, or ISERs, by the end of January, with information from paper FAFSAs to follow. This, I think, caught all of us off guard. I think it caught schools off guard. We certainly hadn't heard about it. Because normally what happens is when a student submits a FAFSA, it gets processed and it's available to the school within 2 to 3 days. So the fact that there's this delay until the end of January is definitely something very different. And obviously that's going to impact schools' ability to start doing anything. It's wonderful for students to get their FAFSAs submitted, but until the schools can get those records and start processing them, they're still kind of in a holding pattern. So we wanted to be sure that you knew that. Based on the fact that we have a brand new FAFSA on a brand new platform, and the fact that schools aren't even going to be sent records until later in January, we're recommending that students wait to file until a week or 10 days after the FAFSA is released. You know, even in regular years when the FAFSA becomes available on October 1st and hasn't been overhauled, we will say, you know what, maybe not do it on October 1st. So it's not that we ever really recommend you do it that first day, but this year in particular, we want people to have a good experience. So we do think this new FAFSA is very user-friendly. I think at the end of the day, we're going to be really happy with it, but it is a new process. So I think holding tight, waiting a few days, let a few bugs get worked out. Maybe there won't be any, but people are still going to be in a really good situation as long as they get the FAFSA filed in the month of January. Students will not be able to make corrections or updates until after January of 2024. So again, the process is going to be they're going to submit the FAFSA. At some point during January, the FAFSAs are going to get processed. And then by the end of the month, those processed FAFSAs will be available to schools. Once all of that happens is when students will be able to start making corrections, which includes adding schools, and when they'll be able to make any other updates. It's also when after that is going to be when schools can start to make corrections. So this is going to be all sequential. And many things need to, happen in this sequence before everything is fully available and schools are going to be able to do all that they need to do, including getting out financial aid offers. Now, when students do submit their FAFSA, they will see their student aid index or their SAI. And the student aid index or SAI is again what's been the renamed EFC or the expected family contribution. So you want to be looking for that SAI, and that will be on the screen when the student submits their FAFSA, and it will be sent to them in an email. So that information will be available as well as their Pell Grant eligibility. So they will know that much as soon as they file. However, they won't be able to go into the FAFSA, like I said, to make corrections or add schools, or to see a copy of what used to be the SAR that is now called the FAFSA Submission Summary, or FSS. That will also not be available until they're thinking early February, okay? So we really want to be sure that when students are filing the FAFSA, that they list any schools that they want to potentially get the FAFSA. They will be able to add schools, but again, not until February. So make sure they get that good list ahead of time. Keep in mind that now students can list up to 20 schools on their FAFSA. So there's plenty of room for all of those schools. Now, sometimes when students are applying for scholarships, the scholarship organization wants to see a copy of what was the SAR, now the FSS. However, again, that's not going to be available to early February. In talking with people from the Worthington Foundation, though, and I think this is probably going to be typical of other organizations, they are aware of all of this taking place. And so at least in Worthington's case, they're going to accept a copy of that submission confirmation email. So students are going to want to hang on to that email in case anyone wants to know what their SAI is, for example, if they're applying for a scholarship. Okay, so that's where things stand with federal student aid. I do want to let you know that there was a letter that went out within the last 2 days to the Department of Education, to the Secretary of Education at the U.S. Department of Education. And it was from all of a variety of bipartisan senators and other legislators. They really want to, the Department of Ed, to make it clear to students what the timelines are going to be so that they have reasonable expectations about what's going to happen. They have also asked that verification be scaled back as much as possible for this year, and that hours be expanded at the call-in center. So, I know we're all a little bit concerned about all of this. Patience is definitely going to be required this year. But hopefully some of these little things can happen to make it a little bit easier for students and families to navigate this process. All right, Nikki, anything I need to address before we move to the next section?
Yeah, do we know if that kind of wait for ICERs is going to continue past the initial applications, or will it go back to a 2-3 day turnaround?
Yes, what's going to happen is once they get processed, and they're made available to the schools, then we will return to the scenario where they're available within 2 to 3 days. Yes. I think what it is, and this is just my thinking on this thing, I do not have official confirmation of this. I think they just aren't ready to quite start processing yet. So what they're going to do is they will start processing, but they'll start it later in the month. But once they start processing, then I think we'll return to the normal schedule, is my understanding. Okay.
That's it. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So knowing that we have, a large audience with maybe some people being super familiar with the FAFSA and others being a little less so, I did want to just share a few basic things about the FAFSA and the process that I thought might put some of the rest of it in context. So many of you are familiar with federal student aid accounts, or what we refer to as FSA IDs. Creating an FSA ID or creating a federal student aid account is the first step in the FAFSA filing process. And so we're going to talk about this more today. But we do want people to know that are not as familiar with this, that how people create a federal student aid account is by going to studentaid.gov. When an account is created, what people are actually doing is setting up a username and a password. We refer to that as an FSA ID. So if anyone ever says, do you have your FSA ID? What we really mean is, have you set up your federal student aid account, and do you know your username and password that you can use to sign into your account? An FSA ID is required to access the FAFSA. Everyone accessing the FAFSA has to have an FSA ID, has to have that account set up. Also, it's to do anything federal student aid related, like to be able to see the details of any federal student loans that have been borrowed, and it serves as a legal signature as well. When creating an account, what an individual is doing is they're providing some of their identifying information, including their social security number, so that their identity can be verified. So, this is a very different thing, setting up these accounts, than setting up an Apple ID or setting up, accounts with all these different organizations or products that we might have set up. Because this is federal student aid, because of the privacy stuff that is related to everything with filing the FAFSA, they want to be sure people are who they say they are. And so part of the process of setting up this account is to have that information verified with the Social Security Administration. So everyone can only have one FSA ID, because everyone's FSA ID is tied to their Social Security number, with the exception of people who don't have one, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. Another thing I just want to provide a little bit of background on, because it is new, is this term contributor. So this is a brand new term when it comes to the FAFSA this year. They did not consult Nikki and I and say, do you think using contributor is a good term? Because we would have said, no, we don't really think so. But this is what they're going with. So a contributor is actually simply someone who has to provide information on the FAFSA, who, in the process of providing information, is going to need to provide consent and approval. We are going to talk more about this. Consent and approval, which is what allows the IRS to disclose their federal tax information, or FTI, more in acronyms, and what allows the Department of Education to use that information and to redisclose that federal tax information to the schools and approved organizations. And that list is shrinking. Someone who is a contributor that has to provide consent and approval will have to have their own FSA ID, okay? So a contributor is not someone who has to pay for school. So certainly part of the federal student aid process is to determine if a family can afford to contribute. And certainly a lot of families need to be contributing in order to make it affordable for their student. But a contributor is not defined as someone who has to provide funding. For a matter of fact, no one can ever make a parent or anybody else pay for school. So a contributor is literally a contributor that is providing information and consent and approval. The student is always a contributor. So every single student, remember the FAFSA is a student application. So the student is always going to be providing information on the FAFSA, and every single student has to have their own FSA ID. Other possible contributors include the parent, if the student's dependent, the parent's spouse in some situations, which we're going to talk about, and if the student is independent and married, then their student spouse may be considered a contributor as well. So let's now talk about, for dependent students specifically, how we determine exactly who is a contributor when it comes to parents on their FAFSA. So I've got basically three scenarios here. So when I'm talking with students and parents or families, what I want to do is I want to share these three scenarios, and hope by the time I'm done sharing the three, they say, okay, that's us. We know which category we fall into and who needs an FSA ID because they have been identified as a contributor. So if parents are married and filed a 2022 joint tax return, okay? Now 2022 is critical because that is the year that the 24-25 FAFSA is using to determine eligibility. Okay, remember we use in the financial aid world prior tax year information. So for the 24-25 FAFSA, it's going to be the 22 tax year. So that's the key year this year. So if parents are married and file a joint tax return, It is going to require information for both parents, and it's going to look at students' eligibility based on both parents' income, but actually only one parent is going to need to have an FSA ID. And that is because one parent, if they're married to each other and file a joint tax return, can grant consent and approval to have their tax information shared. So I'm married, I'm doing a FAFSA, I still only need to be the parent, only one parent needs to be on the FAFSA because I can provide consent and approval. Gosh, Mila, I can provide consent and approval on behalf of not only myself, but also on behalf of my husband. Okay. If parents are married and file 2022 taxes separately, or if parents live together but aren't married, so wouldn't be able to file a joint tax return, then in that case, information for both parents is required on the FAFSA, and both parents are going to need their own FSA ID. And that's because if they're married and file separate taxes, they cannot provide consent on behalf of the other. And of course, if they don't file a joint tax return because they're not married, they can't provide consent on behalf of each other. Okay, so those are the first two scenarios. Now, the third scenario is a two-parter. So the third scenario is if parents are divorced, separated, or never married and don't live in the same household, then what we first have to do is determine which parent provided the most financial support, because that's going to be the parent on the FAFSA. So a little bit of a change here from the past. In the past, it used to be the parent who the student lived with most over the last 12 months prior to filing the FAFSA, but now it is the parent who provided the most financial support. The other parent, believe it or not, in the situation, is not required to provide any information and is not looked at all when it comes to the FAFSA. So let's say, for example, I'm the student and my mother provides 70% of my financial support and dad provides 30%. That when it comes to filing the FAFSA, it's going to be mom who is on the FAFSA, and she's going to need to have an FSA ID and she's going to be a contributor. Dad is not going to be on the FAFSA at all. Okay, so we don't need to worry about that a bit. But then there's one more piece that we have to look at in this situation, and that's if mom is remarried on the day the FAFSA was filed, not in 2022 when taxes were filed, but on the day the FAFSA is filed, then information from mom's spouse would also be required on the FAFSA. No change there. This is the way it's always been, but I think people are still caught off guard by this. Whether or not that spouse needs an FSA ID, you probably know where I'm headed, comes down to whether or not they filed a joint tax return in 2022. If they've been married for a while, they filed a joint tax return in 2022, the scenario I just used, mom can take care of everything and only she needs an FSA ID. However, let's just say they got married over the summer, so they didn't file taxes jointly in 2022, then that spouse also needs their own FSA ID. Okay? So one of the things that we're recommending is that now, before the FAFSA becomes available, that every contributor, once they've been identified, goes ahead and gets their FSA ID created. And we're recommending that people create their FSA IDs at least a week ahead of time. And the reason is for an FSA ID to be fully functional and for people to get the benefit of this new FAFSA and how well it's going to work, we believe, they need to have had their FSA ID authenticated with the Social Security Administration. Now, for those of you who have been listening to us for a long time, we had understood that people basically wouldn't be able to do a FAFSA unless their FSA ID had been authenticated. What's been clarified recently is that if someone goes and gets their FSA ID and immediately wants to start their FAFSA, they can do that. Why it's not recommended, and I think why that scenario wasn't even being shared, is because if someone starts a FAFSA without their FSA ID being authenticated, they're going to have to manually do all of their tax information. And the whole point of this FAFSA, or one of the significant pieces to this new FAFSA, is that the information is going to come over directly from the IRS, and that's going to make it so much easier. So we still stand by that we want people to create their FSA IDs ahead of time, at least, 3 or 4 days, a week is best. But we are internally having conversations about what do we do if someone hasn't. Yes, we can go ahead and we can have them create their FSA ID. But I think, in many situations, we're going to still prefer that they wait till it's authenticated until they file a FAFSA. But there might be other times where we just want them to go ahead and get this done. So more to come on that, but that's a piece that's a little bit different, I know, than what we've been saying previously. So again, just to reiterate, when people are creating an FSA ID, they are going to go to studentaid.gov. Every individual does need to have a unique email address, so no shared email addresses in the system. They all need a unique one. We do recommend that students not use their high school email address. We want them to create a new email account. That's a good idea for a whole variety of reasons. But this FSA ID is going to be needed for years to come. So they're going to need to file a FAFSA annually. If they borrow loans, they're going to need to be able to see what their loan history is. So once the students that are high school seniors graduate next summer, they're going to lose that access to that email. So that's why we want them to create a different email, like a Gmail, Hotmail, whatever, and use that when they create their FSA ID. Now, if you have a student that's already created an FSA ID who used their high school email address, they can simply log in and go to settings, and they can change that email address whenever it's convenient. We also would like people to provide and verify a mobile phone number. It is not required that they do, but the more ways that you have to reset passwords and retrieve usernames, the better. So having an email, having a cell phone number, and all of that in the system is going to make things so much easier down the road. Now, people may already have an FSA ID. Keep in mind that people can only have one. So I use the same FSA ID, whether I'm doing something, whether I was filing a FAFSA as a parent for my oldest child, for my youngest child, or if I were to file a FAFSA because I wanted to go back to school. That is going to be the same FSA ID, the same username and password, because again, your FSA ID is tied to you as an individual and you use the same one. Think of it as your signature. You only have one that you might use in multiple situations. The same thing with your FSA ID. So if you already have one, or you're working with families that already think they might have one because they have an older child, then what we want those individuals to do is to go into studentaid.gov, try signing in, make sure they know their username and password. And if they don't, they can retrieve their username and reset their password now. So when the FAFSA comes out, they're going to be ready to go, and they're not going to be like stressing about, oh my goodness, what do I do now? Last year, it was possible to set up an FSA ID account without an email address. That is no longer the case. So if we had someone last year, for example, that set up an FSA ID but did not provide an email, they are going to have to provide an email this year. Everyone's got to have an email associated with their FSA ID. So that's another reason why, if people already have one, we'd love to have them go in and make sure, again, they know their username and password. And if they haven't had an email account associated with it, that they take care of that now. And if they need to update any information, they can go under settings and they can update anything. If they've moved or, had a new cell phone number or whatever might be the case, any of that can be updated. And if you're going to go to studentaid.gov, these are the current screenshots. When the new FAFSA is rolled out, it's going to look slightly different. The picture is going to be different, but the layout, I believe, is going to be the same. So people can go here to create an account or to log into an account. If people are doing it on a phone, I don't recommend doing the FAFSA on the phone. You could probably set up an FSA ID on the phone. Then you're going to go here to this little person icon. All righty. Nikki, anything before I move on and talk about consent and approval?
Just a question about if parents divorced, not living together, they split expenses 50-50 for the kids. The next question would then be which parent has the most income. That would be
it's most income or assets. I don't like the way they've worded that. They've said income or assets. So I think what people want to be thinking about is, if they feel like they both financially provide the same support, and, maybe the child lives with them about the same amount. And I know that's not the criteria anymore, but I think that it's in the living with the parents where parents are providing that support. You want to start thinking about who provides the health insurance and things like that. So, I think that also, before you even get to it's exactly 50-50, make sure they're thinking about those sorts of things as well. Okay. But if it is 50-50, it's supposed to be the parent who has the higher income or more assets. Okay.
And just one more question. One would argue, why not the lower income? And we get that a lot.
We do, and I will tell you that I was at a session this summer with NCAN, which is a National College Access, well, they're now Achievement, but they basically work in the world of college access, and they were there. And so was the Department of Ed. And I think quietly people are asking that same thing and asking, how is anyone going to know the difference? And I think we just need to know that that probably isn't going to be checked, but that we do when we sign FAFSAs, just say that we're telling, we're being honest. So I'm going to leave that one there. But I hear you. I hear you loud and clear. All right, so let's move on and talk a little bit about consent and approval. So this is another new concept with this year's FAFSA. So you may recall that in the past, there was something called the IRS data retrieval tool. So basically we could go in and we could say, we could put in our information, we could request that the IRS send us information, and then we could share that with the Department of Education. So that's actually what was kind of working. What's happening now is that the information is going to be shared with the information on the FAFSA is going to be shared with the IRS, and they're going to send that information directly to the Department of Education, and then that can be redisclosed to schools. So they've kind of cut us out. We're not a middleman anymore. So what we have to do, because they can't just share our information without our consent and approval, is that everyone has to provide consent and approval. Okay, so every contributor has to provide consent and approval, because if you don't provide consent and approval, the student isn't eligible for federal student aid. So things in the financial aid world, sometimes black and white, sometimes really gray. Black and white on this one, you guys. This is a non-negotiable. Everybody has to provide consent and approval. This includes even non-tax filers. So a 17-year-old student who has never filed taxes before still has to provide consent and approval. Someone who's filed an extension and hasn't filed for this year has to provide consent and approval. Someone who files a foreign tax return is never going to file a tax return with the IRS, still has to provide consent and approval. One of the things that what the IRS will be communicating back is that there is no tax return on file. That in of itself is important information that is considered federal tax information. So everybody has to provide consent and approval. And if people don't provide consent and approval, again, student isn't eligible for federal student aid, but if someone misses it, they can go back in after the fact and provide consent and approval after the FAFSA has been filed. Here is a screenshot of what consent and approval looks like. It gets asked about very early on when the FAFSA is started. So no one's going to miss this. And they do make it really clear. So they kind of get the summary information, but then when they've got lots of detail about what that means, they've even got some FAQs just above the approval piece. So hopefully people will see that and will feel comforted, I hope, by what they're saying, and will know that this is just a non-negotiable, that they have to provide that. All right. Any questions about that, Nikki? Because next up, we're going to talk about creating FSA IDs for parents without social security numbers.
Just quickly, there's a question about verification that I am not quite sure I'm understanding the question, but I think I understand that during verification, if non-tax filers are they're not sending any information, right? There's nothing going over. During verification, they are asked to submit W-2s. And no.
Not anymore.
Okay. So is that a 23-24 going away for 24-25?
Going away for 24-25.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just another question. Go ahead.
Wages are no longer a factor in the same way that they were. We'll talk about that a little bit at the very end.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. So now let's talk about this, because this is one of the newer pieces that we've learned. So there was a webinar on November 2nd from Federal Student Aid where they rolled out this process. We knew that this was going to be possible for people without a social security number to get an FSA ID. We were originally told we'd hear in August, and it wasn't till November, but that webinar is available if people want to listen. So this process is brand new, and it's going to roll out with the FAFSA. So this ability for people without a social security number, parents specifically, to create an FSA ID, this is not available today. This will be available whenever the FAFSA actually rolls out, certainly by December 31st. So currently, you have to have a social security number to create an FSA ID. That's just the way that it is. However, so when an FSA ID is created, they have to provide the social security number and all of that identifying information. But with the rollout, that won't necessarily be required. There's going to be a way that people without a social security number are going to be able to get an FSA ID. Now, one thing I want to say really quickly is that parents have never needed to be an eligible citizen or an eligible non-citizen in order for the student to be eligible for federal student aid. So there's different requirements for the student to get aid that apply to the student specifically, but are not applicable to the parent. So for years, we've had students who are US citizens or eligible non-citizens. They've been able to get financial aid even though their parents are not citizens or eligible non-citizens, okay? No change to any of this. That's all the same way that it has been. So students have always needed to have a social security number and continue to need to have a social security number, with the exception of students from the freely associated states. So we're not going to go into that piece today, but just know that the concept of parents not having a social and students being eligible, there's no change to that process. The only change is that those parents have never been able to get an FSA ID, so they had to sign the FAFSA in a different way. This process is going to allow them to sign the FAFSA electronically, just like people who do have a social. The process is actually really similar. I think we were super relieved when we saw what the process is going to be, because I think there was that possibility it could be a totally different process than when people who have a social security number are creating an FSA ID, but that's not the case. So everyone's going to start by going to studentaid.gov and clicking on create an account, okay? The first step is to provide personal information, including a social security number, of course, if the person has one, if that's applicable. If the person doesn't have one, and this is where this is new, if you go to the do an FSA ID creation today, you won't see this. These screenshots are literally just screenshots. They do not exist real time yet. What's going to be added is that if the parent doesn't have a social security number, there is going to be a box underneath here that says, I don't have a social security number. So someone without a social security number would click that box. Now, what they're going to see next, and I know these are really blurry, these are literally from when Federal Student Aid was doing their webinar, that I grabbed screenshots from them because they have not released these screenshots. So that's why they're blurry. And I'm sorry, but I want you to be able to see, kind of what the experience is going to be. So when someone clicks that box and says, I don't have a social security number, you're going to notice that the box is going to gray out. And then what's going to come up is this message. So they're going to get this warning message that basically they need to, read and see that I'm a parent or a spouse of a student who's applying for aid, and I don't have a social security number. Or again, they're one of those students who is a citizen of the freely associated states. And so then you can continue. What they are trying to make clear is that they don't want people who just don't know their social or don't want to provide their social to go through this process. There are multiple things where they will get, I guess you could say, stopped, because people are going to, systems are going to realize who does and who doesn't have a social. So this is only intended for parents who don't have a social and for those students from the freely associated states. Everyone who has a social has to provide their social. So when creating the FSA ID, it's actually really, really similar. So they're going to go through, they're going to set up their username and password, they're going to provide their email address. They do have to provide a mailing address. That is a requirement. That's asked of everyone, but it's a requirement for them. We strongly recommend that they provide a mobile phone number. And the remaining steps, the challenge questions and all of that, exactly the same as for someone with an SSN. But when they get to the very end, after they have verified their phone number and their email address, there's going to be an extra step. And so that's what I want to show you here. So when we get to the point where we're normally done, and so we've gotten to the point that the phone number's been verified, that, the cell phone, the email address has been verified, they've received their backup code, we're normally done. Individuals without a social will see these additional screens. What they're going to see here is they're going to see these questions that need to verify their identity. They're referred to as knowledge-based questions. So These questions are supplied by TransUnion. So our understanding is that Federal Student Aid is working with TransUnion to develop this process where someone's identity can be verified through a method other than a social security number because they don't have one. So the way in which this is done is they are going to be asked 4 questions. And so those 4 questions should be questions that theoretically only they would know the answers to. And then if they can successfully answer these 4 questions, that's how they're confirming their identity. And then they can have an FSA ID created that they can use. Now, it is being done through TransUnion, but I do want to reassure people that it's been confirmed that there is no credit check, and they don't even have to have a credit history in order for them to be in TransUnion's database. Now, I think one question we all have is, how many people really are in this database? Is everybody in there or not? And that's the things we're going to learn as we go through this process. One of the other key things I want you to know is when they see these questions, and again, there are going to be 4 of them, and they're things like, did you, what street did you previously live on? Or what's a previous phone number for you? So those are some of the examples that they've given us. They're only going to get 1 try though, okay? Because keep in mind, there's 4 questions with 4 potential answers. If you give people too many opportunities, they would be able to probably, eventually get through. So right now it's only 1 try. I have heard in conversations the request to the department to maybe let people have 2, just because, I mean, we've done these questions for other things, and sometimes you're like, gosh, I don't think I remember. So we'll see. But for right now, it is just 1 opportunity to answer them. Now, the good news is if they answer them correctly, then they're going to see this screen. It's going to say, hey, your identity has been verified. And it's going to give them a backup code. They can use their FSA ID immediately. Because again, what the delay is normally with the FSA ID being fully functional is that it has to be authenticated with SSA, excuse me, because this is not a verification of a social security number. If they get through this, they can use it immediately and it will be fully functional. Okay, so that's really, really good news. But we know, obviously, not everyone's going to answer all 4 questions correctly. And if they are not able to answer them correctly, and I know this screen's really blurry, then what they're going to need to do is they're going to need to call Federal Student Aid to go through a different process to confirm their identity. Okay, so they're going to be told that they need to call, and the number is going to be right there. So you can see this screen is directly from Federal Student Aid. People who are in a situation where they can't answer those 4 knowledge-based questions will call this number. A customer service representative will look up their account and will initiate the verification process. They will be assigned a case number and they will be required to provide a variety of types of documentation. Once the documentation has been submitted, it will be reviewed, and if that is then verified, it should be within 1 to 3 days, and then they would be able to use their FSA ID and would be notified of all of that. Okay, so that might sound familiar for any of you who have worked with students who they just can't remember what their username and password is. They were not able to retrieve them. They eventually have to call Federal Student Aid. This is virtually the identical process that someone has to go through to basically get their FSA ID reset and to make it usable again. Now, what is a couple of additional pieces here? One of the things that individuals are going to have to do is to complete an attestation form. And that will be available to them. They'll be mailed that, and it will be available on the studentaid.gov website. They will need to provide proof of identity, again, just like people who need to have their FSA ID reset have to do. In those forms of identity, you only need 1 if you can provide a valid driver's license, a state or city identification card, or a foreign passport, but they do have to be valid and current, okay? If someone can't provide those, then they would provide a utility bill and one of the following items. So you can see what those other 3 options are. Now, I think everyone has a similar question, which is, what if people can't do any of this? And there are also questions about how exactly are they going to be providing that. So what I've heard most recently is that we don't know what's going to happen if they can't do this. So more to come on that. And that probably what they will do is respond to the email and attach documents. That's what it's been previously, through a secure system though. I think that at some point they'll probably have a portal that's been discussed, that they would like to have a portal where someone could just upload this information, but we just don't know for sure exactly how this is going to work. So lots of patience required while we learn a little bit more about this process. So again, if people aren't able to answer those knowledge-based questions, they're going to go through a process that's very similar to the current account recovery process. Case number will be assigned. They will be emailed something and they will have to respond to that. Now, one of the good news things that we have heard is that when calling federal student aid, that customer service support is supposed to be available in multiple languages going forward. Like we're hearing there's going to be 11 of the most common languages where someone will be able to indicate that they need to speak to someone that speaks their language. Again, the details are going to be on the website, but of course they've not been added yet. But that should be helpful because we all know if we've ever tried to call federal student aid that they won't talk to us. They need to talk to the individual. So again, they did a webinar on this on November 2nd, Federal Student Aid, did. That is available in the training center. You can get into the training center to see all of the webinars, but you do have to set up an account, ironically, to be able to get in to view those trainings. All right, that is the process as we understand it, again, knowing that there's a lot still to come. Any questions about that? Not that I necessarily can answer them, Nikki, but any questions that you want to throw out there just in case?
I always like to say, is there any questions I can't answer? Question, I'm curious if FSA has ever shared how this info will stay private. There are some who are undocumented and nervous about creating an FSA ID and being on the radar of customs. I've heard this multiple times.
Yeah, me too. I've definitely heard this. You know, I don't know. I don't have a good response to that. You know, always federal student aid has said that their job is not to, you know, that they want families to feel safe going through this process. I know they continue to say that. But now with this whole piece with TransUnion, you know, and the thing is that now, because I'm not going into some of the details that I might otherwise if we had more time, but now there will not be a paper signature page. That is no longer going to be an option. So someone could file a paper FAFSA, but when you file a paper FAFSA, they're still going to have to verify your identity. So that is, again, falling under the category of we just don't really know how these pieces are going to work. So what I will tell you is that we're paying attention. We're asking these questions. We're attending trainings ourselves all the time. And as soon as we have more information on this, we will absolutely share it with all of you.
Great. So just to back up what you were saying, I think the only comfort I give folks when they are asked about the security of that is knowing how tough they are with us, the state grant agency, about sharing data with us, that I feel somewhat confident that we can realize that the data in the FAFSA is not shared with other departments. That's the only comfort I can give folks. But also, you just brought up another point about filing the paper FAFSA. It will be available, but they can't sign it. And I don't know that I know how that process will.
No, I don't either.
Okay, so stay tuned. And then last question, do we know when a PDF of the application will be available? I have not seen that either.
I have not seen it either. I went out the other day specifically looking for it because I thought I heard maybe it was out, but I could not find it. And to my knowledge, it's not. And usually we get notified. We have a couple of different organizations that keep us up to date as well. And I haven't seen anything. So, but soon.
Yep.
But so people are going to be able to file a paper FAFSA whenever the other FAFSA becomes available. But again, it won't get processed. My understanding with paper FAFSAs is they're not going to process paper FAFSAs until they've started processing online FAFSAs, which again will be well into January. Okay,
that's it. Thank you.
We're just going to keep going, smile and keep going. We're going to get through this, everyone. I promise we will. All right, now I'd like to just take our last few minutes. I've got about 15 left. And I want to talk about some of the changes. So for those of you who have been with us for several of these trainings, and I'm going to show you where you can find past trainings, you might have heard all of this, but I do think that it's worth reiterating because some of you might not have been with us. So one of the significant changes to the FAFSA is that the FAFSA is going to become a roles-based form. So what the FAFSA has been to date is a form where the student is the applicant. The student's always the applicant. They're the one that's applying for aid. But basically, the student would start the FAFSA, and once they got to a certain point, then the parent questions would be available. But now, and Nikki came up with these silos, almost, in that there's going to be a student section and there's going to be a parent section. When the student logs in with their FSA ID, they're only going to see student-related questions. If a parent logs in with their FSA ID and selects parent, they're only going to see the parent questions, okay? And then whoever starts it, either one will invite the other to complete their section of the FAFSA. So let me talk a little bit more about this. When I log in using my FSA ID, or whoever logs in, they're going to get to this screen. So by this point, they put in their username and password. Then they're going to select what role they are in. So again, if I'm the student, I'm going to select that I'm a student. If I'm a parent, I'm going to select that I'm a parent. Once I get into that section, I'm going to only see the questions that are applicable to my role, okay? Either the parent or the student can start the FAFSA. But there are some things we want you to know about what happens when someone starts a FAFSA, because it might impact who starts the FAFSA. We think it certainly will. If the student starts the FAFSA and they are independent, then they will need to invite their parents to complete the parent section of the FAFSA. So whoever starts the FAFSA has to invite the other party to complete their section of the FAFSA. So the student starts the FAFSA, then what they're going to see in their section is they're going to see basically this piece of a screenshot where they have to invite their parent. That's why we talked about contributors. So they've identified who their contributor is, and they have to provide information about that contributor. They're going to need to provide their last name, their date of birth, their social security number. Again, if they have one. A student whose parent didn't have one would simply click the box here, okay? But let's say it's a scenario where the parent has a social security number and an email address. For that reason, we think there needs to be a discussion about who starts the FAFSA, because if the student starts it and gets to this point and doesn't know their parent's social security number, they can't continue. And if they put in the wrong social security number, we've got issues, okay? So I think a lot of the times, maybe not always, it's probably going to make more sense in this scenario for the parent to start the FAFSA. So having that conversation, depending on that individual's family's dynamics, we think is an important thing to do. Because to reiterate again, whoever starts it has to invite the other. Now, once that invitation is sent, so basically once that section of that screen in the FAFSA is completed, then what happens is an email goes out to the other party, and that email goes out immediately. And once that email has been sent, then a link is available and the other party can go in and start the FAFSA. Now, I know we all get told don't click on links in emails. So if an email gets sent and people are uncomfortable clicking on the link, then they can just go to studentaid.gov. And when they log in, then they're going to have the ability to link to the other party's FAFSA. The invitation is basically how the two sections of the FAFSA get connected. So it's absolutely critical that the information is correct, because if the information isn't correct, like the social security number, if a number is transposed or something, these sections aren't going to be connected. And the indication of that is, let's just say my kiddo did the FAFSA, thought they knew my social security number. I get sent an email. I go to studentaid.gov or I click on the link, whichever, and I log in and there's nothing there. It's because my information was incorrect, so it can't link to their section of the FAFSA. So this piece is absolutely critical, that whoever is filling out the FAFSA first has correct information for the other party so that these can be linked together and that the process goes smoothly. Now, just as a quick aside, every time anyone uses an FSA ID, and this is the case now, they're going to have to do two-step verification, where they get that text with a code that they have to put in, or they get the email with a code that they have to put in. And I mention that just because it means that there's going to have to be a lot more collaboration with students and parents. I found this past year, I've been guilty of maybe doing my kids' FAFSAs on their behalf. I admit that, for better or for worse. I couldn't do Noah's because he was at work. And so when I went to use his FSA ID, of course, it's his cell phone number and it's his email address, which it has to be. that gets the code, and I couldn't reach him. So I had to wait until he was home. So I think for parents and students, they are going to have to coordinate the filling out of the FAFSA maybe a little bit more than they have in the past. Here's my perfect world scenario, which is not going to exist, I know, for many people. But the best case scenario, I think, is if parents and students, and I realize this is unrealistic, could be sitting down together and have two devices. And one of them, whichever one, starts the FAFSA. As soon as they fill out that section, that invitation is sent, that email is sent, then the other party can log in, and then they can be completing their section. So you could have the parents completing their section, the student completing their section, each on their own devices, and then, whoever finishes up last can go ahead and submit it. I know that's not very realistic, but if we can try to create that scenario as often as possible, I think that will be great. And then last thing, Nikki, I'm going to just push through for a second, and then I'll take questions if we're on either topic, okay? I just want to talk about a few FAFSA formula changes. So here's some really good news. Almost every income question is going to come directly from the tax return. So there'll be very few questions that people will have to answer about income-related stuff, as long as they have taxes on file and they provide consent and approval, okay? So the federal tax information will be imported into what's called the FTI module. It's not actually going to show on the FAFSA. So don't be surprised when you do a FAFSA, whether you're working with someone or you're doing one for your own situation, that once that consent and approval is granted, you will not see any income information show up in the FAFSA, nor will it show in the FAFSA submission summary. And unlike in the past, it won't even be a field that says, income information was transferred. It just doesn't show up at all, okay? It's there, it's living behind the curtain, it's being used to determine eligibility, but it does not show up in the FAFSA. Now, there's some limited cases where people will have to manually enter their federal tax information. That would be in a case where they don't provide consent and approval. Again, we want to avoid that always, or when their FAFSA hasn't been authenticated yet, or their FSA ID, excuse me. We want to avoid that as well. But then there are going to be these cases like someone who was married in 2022 who's now divorced. Their tax information for 22 is not reflective of their current situation. So a series of questions will be asked, and when appropriate, a manual pathway will open up. We have not seen that manual pathway. We don't know exactly what it looks like, but we will soon enough. And we'll share information on that once we have that. And I can't reiterate this enough. Everybody must provide consent and approval, even those who don't file taxes. Now, more good stuff. The untaxed income page is gone. There is no untaxed income page, which means that people who make contributions to a retirement account pre-tax don't have to provide that information, and that information therefore is not impacting financial aid eligibility. So that's a really good thing, I think, for the student's perspective, obviously, and eligibility. Workers' comp doesn't have to be provided. And that question about, is anyone providing cash support or paying money on your behalf? That's gone as well. That means if grandparents own 529s and, in the past they were supposed to report how much they had received from other people in a 529 distribution, that question is gone. So that no longer has any impact at all. People aren't as excited about this one. The parent SAI, again, the SAI Student Aid Index that replaced the EFC, will no longer be divided by the number in college. The question will remain on the FAFSA. So, when you see that question, say, oh, see, Mila was wrong. They are still asking about that. Yes, they are asking, but it is not going to impact financial aid eligibility for federal student aid. But families can request a special circumstance review. So if families do have multiple kids in college and are finding paying for multiple kids to be challenging, then they can go to the school and ask for them to do a special circumstance review. Now, what they're going to have to demonstrate is that, this is financially burdensome on them. So if I have two kids in college, and one is going, say, to community college and tuition's being covered, and I don't have any expenses, they're not going to take that into account. So you're going to have to demonstrate, or families are going to have to demonstrate the financial impact of having two in college. But I think schools, are ready for this. I hope. They're going to be so inundated, but just know that, it is appropriate to reach out and ask them about that if that is your circumstance. Okay, good news here. So there's several ways in which families will not have to provide any assets. So there's always been some pathways, if people met certain criteria, that they didn't have to provide asset information, and those have been expanded. So here's who does not have to provide asset information on the FAFSA. Families receiving any federally means-tested benefits. So that means anyone in the family, and it's going to be for this FAFSA in 22 or 23, will be exempt from having to provide assets. So if someone says, yes, I'm receiving that benefit, they will not see any asset questions. Okay, it's in the parent section. If people earn less than $60,000, and depending on the tax schedule that they file, they typically would not have to provide any asset information as well. Okay, so much broader. These are or statements, not and statements anymore. Now, I want to revisit this federally means tested benefit one, because one of the questions still remains for this year is free and reduced lunch. Every public school student in Maine is receiving free and reduced lunch. The way the question is asked is, do you receive? We have gotten confirmation from federal student aid and from all sorts of other sources as well, but directly from federal student aid, that every single public school student should say yes to the free and reduced lunch question. Okay, so all of the seniors out there who are attending public schools should say yes to this question, or their parents in the parent section say yes to this question, and no asset information will have to be provided, or even if it was provided, wouldn't be calculated in. And the reason I'm saying that is the student did their section first and the parent hadn't done their section. They might see their assets questions because the parents haven't answered this question yet. But even if it's provided, it's going to be ignored. Once it's noted that they are receiving one of these federally means tested benefits, you won't even see asset questions asked at all. Okay, so please do that. And I know that people are a little uncomfortable with that, but yes, we have seen that confirmed. We can share that with you if you're still uncomfortable. This is like a gift, right? This is a gift for this 1 year to families in Maine and in 7 other states. And so I hope everyone will be sure that they do that. There are some assets that are no longer exempt. So it shouldn't be that big a deal this year, because I think so many people are going to be exempt from providing assets, but a small family-owned business is no longer exempt, nor is the family farm. The primary residence is still excluded if they live on that farm, but the rest of the farm is not. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention is that child support, because there is no untaxed question, untaxed income section, excuse me, can't be asked there, which is where it used to be asked. So that will be in the asset questions. So I know that seems bizarre that child support received is going to be in the asset section, but it is. Which means if you don't have to provide asset information, you don't have to answer the child support received question either. All righty, that's what I had. And I have resources I want to share, but before I share those resources, Nikki, any questions to address?
Very good questions. Someone mentioned that according to a NASFA webinar yesterday on verification, that colleges would need to obtain W-2s to determine if they should have filed a tax return. Because some folks don't file a tax return, but doesn't mean that they don't necessarily have to. It's just that they just didn't. So that's the verification piece.
Okay, I will check into that
question.
Yeah, I will check into that. That was not my understanding, but I, again, there's a lot of new information this year, and there's a lot that's changing. And verification is one of those areas where they haven't released a lot of information. I will say that the goal is to make verification as simple as possible this year. So let me follow up on that one and get back to you. Okay?
Yeah, I'll flag that for follow-up email. Another question, I think this is a multiple parter. Income questions that are asked, even when consent is provided regarding foreign income exclusions, pension rollovers. And I feel like that's 2 separate situations. Is that information on a tax return or a schedule? So going with the foreign income first, that is income that is not on a tax return, because that's foreign income. They wouldn't have filed a U.S. tax return.
Yes, and my understanding is that is one of those that, when I said almost every single question would come off the tax return, I think there are 2 questions, and one of them is the foreign income question. So people will they will all see that and have to answer that manually.
And I feel like I've seen a place where pension rollovers added, but I can't remember where.
Yeah. I know
we need each other.
my question on the rollover, so I'm going to follow up on this one too, Nikki. My question on the rollover, and I know I've seen it and I can't pull it forward at the moment.
Yep.
What happens is that is on a tax return. So that is going to come over with the tax information. What I can't recall is how it's supposed to be handled. So it used to be that there was a question on the FAFSA that if there was a rollover, it asked you, or if there was a pension distribution, it would ask you if there was a rollover. And you could say, yes, that was a rollover and put in the amount. And then it basically was excluded from eligibility. So I think it's the same way with this one, but I'm just not 100% sure whether it's that way or whether it would require someone to follow up with the school. So let me get the answer to that.
And then last question, if family has non-retirement investments, is it too late in the stage of the game to move those funds to a retirement account?
No, assets are on as of the day you file the FAFSA. So unlike those of us who are getting older and thinking about look back periods for things like, all of these other programs, no, there's no look back period when it comes to assets in financial aid. So it's as of the day the FAFSA is filed. So if they were moved before that, you're good to go. You're being honest and you're just saying what you have on the day you file the FAFSA.
That's it.
Okay. All right. So the last thing before we shut down for today is that we do have a bunch of recordings that have already been done. So if you would like to listen to some of the sessions, we have a page that is our FAFSA simplification page, has recordings and slide decks from a bunch of trainings that we've done. We've been doing this series called FAFSA Fridays. So every month we've done a FAFSA Friday. Just so you know, FAFSA Friday is this week. So on Friday, we will be doing another FAFSA Friday. I think we're going to focus a lot on questions and answers that have come up. A little bit different one. We usually play Kahoot and have fun. But if you want to go back and check some others, like today, we did not talk at all about Pell Grants, the expansion to Pell Grants and the transparency related to Pell Grants. Lots of good stuff there. We didn't talk at all about pathways for students with, these challenging circumstances. The October FAFSA Friday did deal with all of that. So if you're curious about that, you can check that out. On the page, we also have 10 important changes to the FAFSA. We have a glossary of terms so that you can see what was old and new and all of that. We have some case studies on there as well. So those resources are all living on that page. You can register for the FAFSA Fridays right there on that page as well. We are also adding to the page, but I have put the links in here as well. The FAFSA prototype. So if you wanted to get a walk through at least one scenario in the FAFSA, you can do that. You can use the prototype to kind of get the feel of what the FAFSA experience is going to be like. And then they do have the financial aid estimator that is available so that students can fill in some information, get an estimate of the financial aid that they might be eligible to receive, as well as what the SAI is estimated to be. Okay, so those are pretty good tools, and you can check those out and share those with students. And again, they'll be added to that FAFSA simplification page very shortly. And then last but not least, I wanted to let you know that the Wednesday webinar, we're actually going to walk through the FAFSA for the Wednesday webinar in January. And we are going to expand that session to an hour and a half because we want to be sure we have enough time because this year, anytime we're talking about the FAFSA, we're running out of time. So, so I hope you'll join us then. You can go to famemaine.com and register. If you would like, we'll be sending out the invitation 2 weeks ahead, as we always do. So thank you all so very much. I really appreciate you being here. I'm going to stop recording, but I'm going to stay on for just a second, Nikki. So if you can hold tight. Thank you. Wishing everyone very happy holidays.